All right, girls. This unit is called Feeding the World, and it's APES material because it deals with nutrition and food and hunger and how to feed our hugely growing population while maintaining sustainable ways of producing our food, making sure our soil is still being not being over depleted or just keeping it healthy. And we want to feed our people. We want to make sure that they stay alive, and we also want to make sure that our soils stay healthy so that we can continue to produce food for our people. And this is a complex kind of chapter because it also deals with social, political, and businesses is a big, huge one, as you've already seen. And this is the farmer that you've seen in Food Inc. He's the organic farmer that keeps his cows outdoors and all these chickens outside. And he allows his animals to fertilize the soil, or he lets the chickens roam around and like eat the worms that are left behind when stuff is being decomposed on the ground. It's kind of a little self-sustaining little ecosystem that he's got going on. Excuse me. This is an old graph that you've seen before when we were talking about the human population and how it grew so fast. Um, about 10,000 years ago, humans developed agriculture, and so that means that they now have a chance or had a chance to store some food for times of scarcity. And well, because of that, the more supplies that you have, the more likely it is that you'll survive. And so the human population slowly grew, and more recently it grew thanks to industrialization and the development of technology and medicines, which prevented us from dying so much too. And when problems arise with too many humans, in terms of this chapter, we'll think about how we're going to feed this hugely growing population and the sort of environmental degradation that results from there just being a whole bunch of people too. So this is a graph of global undernutrition. So thanks in about the 1950s, thanks to the Green Revolution, which meant that we developed new technologies for agriculture. We started to feed the world a little bit better. And so you start to see that after that, global undernutrition sort of goes down. Well, it's starting to go back up again. And I believe that number is like 24,000 people a day, I believe, die from starvation. Um, and a lot of this, of course, these are a lot of them are children in underdeveloped developing nations. Excuse me. um, so famine. Oh, I think this is in the next slide, but let's stay on here. Famine is large-scale food shortage and starvation and deaths due to it. Food insecurity means that people have the lack of access to an adequate amount of food. And actually, it's kind of a day-to-day food insecurity. Like if they don't have enough food for the day, you also call that food insecurity. Or food security means that you are able to get enough food. So it doesn't say here what nutritional requirements are, but your book tells you that on average, humans consume about 2,200 calories a day. This is kind of what you need to be healthy, to perform your work, to play, to grow healthily. Um, Undernutrition means you're not consuming enough calories to be healthy. And this image over here is of a little boy. Um, and this is a very distinctive extended belly that you see in kids who are starving, and we call this kwashiorkor. Um, and it just has to do with the fact that like if, when he's starving, he doesn't have correct liquid uh, wastes removal, and so a lot of it gets swollen in his belly, and that's very definitely a sign of undernutrition. Malnourished are people that lack the correct balance of proteins, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals, even if they're eating enough calories. So this means that you're lacking some sort of important nutrient, even if you are having your 22,000 calories a day. And this is actually happening a lot more in developed countries. Anemia is the most widespread sign of being malnourished. It means that you have a lack of iron in your diet, usually from lack of proteins like fish, meats. Most widespread deficiency, that's what I meant. And overnutrition means you have too many calories in improper foods. And they can cause a person to become overweight. Overnutrition can then put people at risk for things like type 2 diabetes, heart disease. So remember that people can be malnourished or, well, of course, overnourished, and be overweight. This is becoming definitely an issue with our Western diets full of sugars and fats that might fill you up but don't give you any nutritional value. It doesn't have all the nutrients that you need. Oh, and here's just an image of kind of our processed foods and all these sorts of foods that are chock full of fat and sugars, which we are evolutionary wired to adore, but they don't provide us with the appropriate nutrients for growing. Some images of other deficiencies, and we'll talk a little bit more about these during the unit. Vitamin A deficiency can lead to a lot of blindness, especially in children. It's kind of a big deal. Iodine deficiency can lead you to have this goiter, this enlargement of your thyroid. And this is a picture of the little boy with kwashiorkor. All different types of deficiencies. Poverty is the primary reason for undernutrition. Folks that lack the appropriate resources to buy their food, even though food experts say that there's enough food for everyone on the planet. So it's really just a matter of distributing our food accordingly, right? Social, political, economic factors may be involved in the in inadequate food for people. Just think about wars and refugees that leave their farms, they go hungry. Politics may lead to bad food supply planning, like in Haiti. Remember when we were talking about Haiti right here? They got rid of all the trees, their soils became unusable, so they can't grow food. Where are they supposed to grow food if their soil is crap? Another reason for undernutrition and malnutrition is that our agricultural resources are being diverted to feed livestock and poultry rather than people. So that just means that if we're growing crops like corn and soy in this country a lot, instead of it going to feed the people, it goes to feed the animals because we really like to eat meat. Remember that there's a loss in energy transfer from trophic level to trophic level. So all the crop that the cow ate, all those millions of calories or whatever, aren't all stored within the cow. The cow uses most of those calories for its own cellular needs, for its metabolism, and it lost a bunch of those calories in that way to power its own life. So now when I eat the cow, I only get about 10% of all that it had eaten in its life. So if folks were to directly eat producers, then we'd be able to supply more food to more people. And this is just a picture of housing in Haiti, just to kind of remind you that there are social economic factors for why people are undernourished. Global grain production from the 1950s. Let's see if I wrote down any notes for this. No, not really. 60% of human intake worldwide of the crops, our major crops, are corn, rice, and wheat. That's what this is trying to tell you. So it doesn't say it very well. So know these. Corn, rice, and wheat, top crops of the world. And we eat a lot of it. We eat a lot of it. Although now it seems that per capita, per person, basically, it's sort of stabilizing. Here's some wheat fields. Here's some rice fields because I love the pictures. Annual meat consumption. In the U.S., we are eating more and more meat, but it's occurring globally too. Everyone's just eating more meat, and that just kind of tends to happen. As income increases, people tend to eat more meat. And this is just another sort of bar graph to remind you that the land needed to produce a kilo of food for animals is much, much greater than the land that you need for producing fruits, potatoes, and vegetables. And it goes the same for water. So you need a lot more water for the same reason, because you need to water more land to feed your beef, to feed your cow. And you have to give your cow lots of water too. It takes more water, more land to feed your animals than it does to grow producers. So the Green Revolution is a big, important topic, and it's new management techniques and mechanization, as well as the triad of fertilization, irrigation, and improved crop varieties. This revolution, Green Revolution, increased food production dramatically, and has happened after started happening after World War II, where we started to use more machines, mechanization. We started to increase our use of fertilizers, mostly synthetic. We started to improve our irrigation techniques. We started to use more water, and we learned how to develop better selectively bred as well as genetically modified crop varieties. Increased our food production. We got to feed the world better. Of course, it has some pros and cons to it, right? And this will be related to Food Inc., where we will eventually discuss the pros and cons of modern food factories. Hi girls, I think I lost some footage there, so I'm going to start again. We're talking about the Green Revolution, how the Green Revolution increased food production by increasing fertilizers, increasing the use of machinery, improving our irrigation techniques, and improving our crop varieties. So irrigation, we used more water and we used it more efficiently. Benefits included getting water to places where there were low amounts of water and getting it there a little more efficiently, and coming up with new irrigation techniques and things like that. And that was all great. But there are some problems, of course, with irrigation. First off, if you're watering a lot, irrigation will deplete your groundwater aquifers. It'll lower your water tables. That might be a problem for just, making sure the population gets water. But in addition, irrigation can cause your soils to be degraded or unusable. You may have waterlogging, which is when your soil remains underwater for a prolonged period of time. It impairs root growth because the roots are basically drowned in water. They can't get enough oxygen. Another problem is salinization, which is when you have small amounts of salts in your irrigation water. Well, they get more and more concentrated at the soil surface or even below the soil surface when water is evaporated. So you end up with little hard salt crystals left behind. And it gets worse and worse with more irrigation water. Just remember that land vegetation is not particularly salt tolerant, so increasing the concentrations of salts is going to be bad for the life of your plant. And these are some pictures, but I have posted a couple of videos on salinization. So this one's a picture of salinization, how you end up with the little salts that are in the irrigation water to begin with. They stay behind when the water evaporates. You add more salts stay behind when the water evaporates. More salts stay behind. So you increase the amount of salt with more irrigation water. And this is showing you waterlogging, how if you add a lot of water, which is what you do when you're irrigating, you end up sort of drowning the roots of your plants. So as part of the Green Revolution, we also massively increased our use of fertilizers. And fertilizers are just nutrients that are going to help your plants, your crops grow. For the most part, we're talking about limiting nutrients. So that would be your nitrates or your ammonias, anything nitrogen-y, and your phosphates back into the soil so that you can produce again. So organic fertilizers are organic matter from plants and animals, mostly made from animal manure that is allowed to decompose. That's why you heard in Food Inc. The organic cow herder mentioned something along the lines of like, well, the cows are doing the whole thing. They're harvesting the grass and they're fertilizing it too. Those are organic fertilizers, mostly made from already living or were originally living things. Inorganic fertilizers are synthetic. They're factory produced fertilizers produced commercially, and they're pretty much the standard used in agriculture throughout the country. To make inorganic fertilizers, you have to go through a very energy intensive combustion process. You're combusting natural gas, which allows nitrogen from the atmosphere to be fixed and captured in fertilizer. So you're doing factory produced synthetic nitrogen fixation, which takes up a lot of energy, a lot of fuel. A lot of fuel is used to make these fertilizers. Keep that in mind. Monocropping. Monocropping is when you're growing a large amount of a single species of plant, and it's a technique that we've developed to increase food production. So you do end up with a huge amount of food of this single species. So mono means one, crop means crop. So one crop, single species of plant. But there are some cons to it, of course. So first off, I have this huge field that I had to just completely plow down, remove all the plants, all the vegetation that used to be there. So that's removing lots of different species. But I replaced it with just one species. So I've already decreased my biodiversity in this region. Another problem, though, is because you have this huge field, I could technically harvest all of this all at once. And the reason it's a problem, it's great because now I get to feed a whole bunch of people, but if I harvest it all, I leave behind just bare soil. And what happens when you have bare soil? Well, now it's susceptible to erosion, for the most part by wind erosion. And that could potentially decrease the fertility of my soil if my soil is being eroded away. Another problem with monocropping is I have this huge field of wheat. Now, I might have predators that adore wheat, so grasshoppers or whatever eats wheat. And they have this huge buffet of wheat. Well, what happens when you have such huge food supply? Well, you have your pests that can now eat and reproduce like crazy. So their numbers skyrocket. and I have too many pests eating my crop. Because of that, now I'm going to want to spray my fields with pesticides to get rid of my pests. So that's potentially a big problem, pests, and then the use of pesticides to get rid of them. Leads us to pesticides. Pesticides are substances that kill or control organisms that people consider as pests. Insecticides kill insects. Herbicides kill plants. Fungicides, kill fungus, kill a fungus. And there's two broad types. We call them first generation pesticides, and you can think of these as kind of your organic pesticides. They've been around since at least the 1600s, and they're mostly derived from plants. That's why you can think of them as the organic one, first generation. For example, I have a picture here of tobacco dust. Well, nicotine, the chemical found in tobacco plants, is a natural pest deterrent. So people used to use it a lot, and people do now. So like organic farmers might use tobacco dust on some other plants, depends on what it is. Second generation pesticides are synthetically made, again, factory made, energy intensive chemicals that we started developing in the 40s. And ever since we have increased the use of pesticides by at least 50 times. A couple more terms for pesticides. Broad spectrum pesticides, pretty straightforward, I hope, means that they're designed to kill a broad variety of pests. Selective pesticides are designed to kill a narrower range of organisms. So selective, they might only kill just ants, as opposed to ants and bees and birds and everything. One of the consequences of pesticide use is residue that's left behind and that is persistent. Remember that term. So persistent pesticides remain in the environment for a long time. They persist. Non-persistent pesticides break down relatively rapidly, usually in weeks to months. Well, if pesticides are persistent, they have more of a chance of bioaccumulating. So remember that means that they form higher and higher concentrations in organisms as the pesticide goes up the trophic level, basically. And I'm not sure if you guys remember, but when we were talking about lake effect, we mentioned that a lot of persistent chemicals in general tend to be found in fatty tissues. It takes longer for them to be gotten rid of in your fatty tissues. An example, a famous example, is DDT. I'll show you a video clip of it. It was this incredibly, crazily, insanely overly used insecticide. They would spray it everywhere. They would put it in paints. They would put it in their doors. They would put it in their homes. They would put it on their dogs. They definitely overused it because it was such a great killer of insects. But if an organism containing the pesticide was eaten, the chemical was transferred to the consumer. So say a bird ate like a bug, and then a cat ate the bird that had eaten tons of bugs that had DDT residue on them. So your kitty cat's gonna die. This eventually leads to very high pesticide concentrations at higher trophic levels. And Ms. Rachel Carson, an important name to know, was the first advocate against the widespread use of DDT in her book called The Silent Spring. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Just because I think this is interesting, we have what we call a dirty dozen, 12 fruits and veggies grown that scientists have found contain a high amount of pesticide residue on them. Apples, strawberries, grapes, a lot of these nicely yummy, thin-skinned fruits and veggies. Dirty dozen. lots of pesticide residue left behind because we use lots of pesticides on crops, like ridiculous amounts. So if you want to buy organic fruits and veggies, these are definitely the ones to buy to limit your pesticide residue. We have what we refer to as the clean 15 fruits and veggies that either have a protective layer so that even if we do spray them with tons of pesticide, the pesticide doesn't actually get into the fruit, the fruit that you eat part, or they may be naturally sort of deterrents of pests anyway, like onions. Like there aren't too many pests that are big fans of onions because onions have these like sulfur, compounds that make them less tolerable to organisms. So less worried about pesticide residues in these clean 15 produce. Pesticides. The problem with using pesticides more and more and more is that pesticides gradually become less effective as your pests evolve resistance to the pesticide. So they become resistant. That means the pesticide no longer kills them. And a pesticide treadmill is this sort of cycle of having to find a new pesticide because my pest has developed a resistance to one pesticide. And then it develops resistance to the new pesticide, and then I have to develop a new pesticide. And then pests develop a resistance to that. You get the picture, right? So the way it happens, I just want to review this because maybe you haven't had bio in a long time, is say I have an original population of pests right here, and I spray a pesticide on this population. Well, it kills a whole bunch of them, except for the ones that already have this natural resistance. Well, if these guys are resistant to my pesticide doesn't kill them, well, they get to survive, they get to reproduce, and the next population has a whole bunch of them. And I try to spray them with my pesticide, and they're resistant, so it's not going to kill them. My pesticide no longer works. I have to come up with a new pesticide that's going to kill this population. And that's your pesticide treadmill, where you have to keep developing new pesticides to kill your resistant pests. I'll take a break for a second here because I need to. All right, girls, I'm taking a second to do sort of a review of something your book kind of already assumes that you know, but something that doesn't really correctly go over. And that is genetic alterations. So your green revolution increased your irrigation, increased your fertilization, increased pesticide use, increased the production of food, farming also used genetic alterations to improve crop varieties. And your book only mentions genetic engineering, and I think that is absolutely completely unfair because it began with selective breeding first. And so I'm going to as quickly as possible, go over what these genetic alterations are, and a little bit of going back into genetic engineering, like the book actually talks about. So I want to start with selective breeding because that is the more original way that humans have been altering crops and animals and all sorts of stuff for many years. And this is kind of what I teach freshman bio, so I'm going to go through it kind of quickly. So selective breeding is when you're choosing individuals that have traits that you want to breed for the next generation. It's not genetic engineering. It's not a type of genetic engineering because you are choosing for traits. So say that I am trying to pick the sweetest strawberries ever. So I'm going to pick my strawberries and I'm going to taste them, of course. And the sweetest ones, and only the sweetest ones, those are the ones I'm going to allow to breed for the next generation. And so every generation, I'm only picking the sweetest ones, okay? And that's how you breed for the traits that you want, for sweet, for red, for big. Selective breeding is a type of altering of your organisms because you're breeding for traits of the whole entire organism. You just don't know anything about the DNA or the genes involved in those traits. You're breeding the whole animal. Done for thousands of years, and my favorite selective breeder, in terms of very interesting, is this Luther Burbank guy. How do people enhance mutations in order to breed for them? Well, they use chemicals to do that too. Or they might use high energy radiation, sodium azide, whatever. There are ways to enhance the mutations so that we can choose for traits that we want. And by selectively breeding, this man, Luther Burbank, was able to develop what we know of as your russet potatoes. So all your French fries are made out of russet potatoes, Shasta daisies, and he selectively bred for a cactus that didn't have spines, so that he could feed it to horses. So you take the cactus with the least number of spines, you let it breed. You take its offspring and select the ones with the least number of spines, and then you breed those. And you keep doing it until eventually you have spineless cactus. And he also developed these white blackberries that I just think are really interesting. Selective breeding led to the breeding of these early girl tomatoes that were disease resistant, fast growing, very productive, produced lots of tomatoes. And selectively breeding we humans have done to breed all the various types of dogs that we have. They all came from their ancestor, the wolf, the gray wolf. And look at all the different sorts of traits that we have bred for these dogs to have, including being tame. Selective breeding led to what we know of as our modern banana. Bananas in the wild were originally bitter. They had these humongous seeds, and we would breed them to breed the sweetest, to breed the ones with the smallest seeds, and they just happened to turn up to be really bright yellow and have this banana shape. Genetic engineering, on the other hand, also called biotechnology or genetic modifications, when we're making specific changes to the DNA. We know what the DNA is that we're changing for the most part. And there are benefits, there are pros, there's cons to genetic engineering. Benefits include greater yield. So scientists are engineering for crops that can grow the fastest with the least amount of water, with the pesticide resistance or for pest resistance, we are breeding them to be higher in food quality. In some cases, we're breeding them to have higher nutritional value. And because of that, because we have been able to breed these great crops quickly, more efficiently, in more massive numbers, we make more food. And we reduce world hunger by increasing food production. But this also means increased profits for the biotech companies or the agribusiness companies. And whenever you have increased profits, that starts to, change people a little bit in companies and businesses. So here's a picture of a corn that has been infested by a corn-eating pest. And here is a genetically modified corn in which scientists put in a gene from a bacteria that has its natural resistance to the pest. They put it into the DNA of this corn so it can grow. And it has this natural protein, or this protein that occurred naturally in the bacteria in it. And so it can fight off, it can resist being eaten by that pest. In this case, we have what we call golden rice. You may have heard of golden rice before. Scientists take a vitamin A gene that they cut out from a daffodil plant, and they paste it into just plain old white rice. Vitamin A gene is going to produce vitamin A, And in this case, kids who eat this golden rice, they have a great amount of vitamin A in their diet so that they can reduce the vitamin A deficiency, reduce the blindness caused by vitamin A deficiency. I'll let you guys read through those two on your own to just kind of compare and contrast selective breeding and genetic engineering because they are different, but they both do alter crops. Concerns about genetically modified organisms. So people are a little worried because it's still a fairly new technology, only about like 30 years old or so. They're concerned about the long-term effects of genetically modified plants and animals, I guess, ethically. They want to know if GMOs are safe for human consumption. Some people think that if you're altering genes from one plant to another, that there may be some sort of allergic reaction to it. So far, the studies don't show that, but it's a concern people have. Effects on biodiversity. While you're creating these efficient, wonderfully growing plants, they may outcompete all the other natural plants out there. So that this is a valid concern that GMOs, because they'll outcompete everything, they will decrease the biodiversity by beating everything out, right? And the other concern is about regulation of GMOs. So there's no regulations on using them or even on labeling them still. So that's a valid concern there. Let me stop for a second here again. All right, I'm going to see if I can do this really quickly because I've already made it really long, and I'll do a lot of this in class, hopefully, especially when we're talking about pros and cons. You have to know a little bit about different farming methods. So understand that conventional agriculture is modern-day agriculture, and it's industrial, meaning we have usually big, huge crops, big, huge, massive farms, smaller numbers of workers, lots of machinery, usually single crops, usually row crops, meaning they're planted in a row. Very efficient machinery, does lots of work, in the long run spends less money to produce more food, but it is very oil dependent, very energy dependent here. Traditional farming is also called subsistence farming because they are farming for their subsistence. It's used in the developing world where the machinery is just human labor and some animals, and they make enough food for themselves. Traditional farming, it's used in like 40% of the world. Shifting agriculture is sometimes also called rotational farming. It's used in areas that have nutrient poor soils. So it means that you plant an area for a few years until you deplete that land of its nutrients. And then you move on to another sort of nearby area and you plant for a few years till you deplete its nutrients. You move to another little part of the land, so on and so on. The point being that you don't go back to plant in your nutrient poor area for the place where you've depleted until it's gotten a good chance to recoup some nutrients and recycle some matter there. Nomadic grazing, might also be called rotational grazing, is where you move your herds of animals from one place to another. So nomads are moving, right, to find productive feeding grounds. You move them from place to place. We've spoken about desertification before. It's a type of land degradation. It's when your soil is degraded due to agriculture to the point at which they are no longer productive. Basically, you've either overproduced on this land. You've tried to produce so much that you depleted the soil of its nutrients, and it's no longer arable to use. And once your soil is not usable, it literally kind of looks like a desert. Nothing can grow on it. When we're talking about biomes, we're talking about little vegetation grows on there, and it's not raining too, but you get the picture. Sustainable agriculture is when you're producing enough food to feed the world's population, but you're not destroying the soil. You're not destroying the land. You're not, or at least you're trying to not. You're decreasing your pollution, and you are trying to maintain biodiversity. So you're trying to not reduce the biodiversity. There's different methods that you can do this. For example, you can intercrop, which means that instead of growing a monocrop, a single crop, you grow at least two crops at the same time in the same field. And this is especially great if you are, for example, growing anything, corn, wheat, whatever, with a legume, so a nitrogen fixing plant. Remember that that's going to be super duper important because nitrogen fixing plants are the ones that can nitrogen fix and sort of accelerate the nitrogen back into the nitrogen nutrients back into the soil so that other vegetation can use it. Crop rotation means that you rotate your crops from season to season. For one season you plant wheat, for another season you plant a legume, some nitrogen fixing plant. The season after that you go back and you plant your wheat. Different plants, different crops require different nutrients, and so that minimizes your nutrient depletion. Agroforestry means that you intercrop trees with vegetables. Might be very beneficial for very windy areas because trees help to prevent wind erosion, but they also have lots of beneficial bacteria in their roots that will help to recycle nutrients. Contour plowing is when you have plowing and harvesting parallel to the land to prevent erosion. I think I've shown you a picture of that before. I wonder if I have it here. Yeah, good. So contour plowing prevents erosion by wind and water, because instead of being just planted slanted down on a hill where the rain would easily wash it away, if you build these contours, you're kind of building little barriers so that the water doesn't keep flowing right down. And you can crop on them to help with that prevention of erosion too. Here's some intercropping. You've planted something in alternating fashion. Agroforestry, kind of pretty. These are all pretty pictures. I love them. No-till agriculture. So tilling is when you you stick a big machine and you rotate the soil. And it's good to rotate your soil in some ways because you are bringing nutrients from a little further below up to the surface. But if you're doing so, you are making the soil a little less compacted, a little more easy to blow away with the wind, to erode via wind. There you go. So no-till agriculture is when you don't till it, you don't rotate it. Instead, whatever you plant, you don't till it. You let it just biodegrade on there, and this helps to stop soil degradation because it leaves all this crop residue behind, which can then decompose and recycle nutrients back into the soil. And that's kind of a big purpose of it. In addition to it sort of holding in the water, and when you have some wet soils, moist soils, you're less likely to lose it via wind erosion too. So a lot of this stuff has to do with erosion, by the way, as you can tell, and nutrient recycling. So basically you don't till, you leave the crop there even after you harvest it, and it's good for recycling nutrients quickly. A con is that since you have things decomposing on here, it may be a little more susceptible to pests than usual. So you'd have to come up with some nice organic pesticide to prevent pests from growing too much here. Integrated pest management is when you're using a variety of techniques that are designed to minimize pest from coming to eat your crops to begin with. So for example, you rotate your crops. So you might have wheat or corn or something that's like a staple crop. That makes a lot of money. But right next to it, you might want to plant onions or garlic or something that doesn't really attract the pests so much. And so you can rotate your crops in that fashion to prevent pesticide use, or to decrease your pesticide use. Intercropping, similar idea. I'm sorry, I meant intercropping when I said the alternating crop before. But crop rotation, same thing. Maybe you planted just onions and you don't till it. There's so many different ways to do this, huh? And then you plant your fancier, more money-making crop on top of it, and you still decrease the amount of pesticide that you can use. Planting pest-resistant crop varieties, including tobacco, Oh, I shouldn't promote that. Creating habitats for predators, limiting your use of pesticides, or at least your use of industrial pesticides. And I do not have the caption for this, but I assume that people, before being trained to integrate for pest management, used a lot of pesticide, and then afterwards they used less, but they ended up getting a higher yield after they used integrated pest management, so their crops ended up being a higher yield anyway. And that likely has a lot to do with pesticide use does get rid of your pests, but it may also affect your plants because they are living things too, right? And your soil, because it may also mess up your soil. Organic agriculture is when folks produce crops without using synthetic pesticides or synthetic fertilizers. It's at least like 75%. You have to have like 75%. Let me double check that number just to be sure. Organic pesticides and organic fertilizers for you to be able to label your products as organic. Organic meaning your pesticides are, animal or plant derived, or your fertilizers are originally animal or plant derived. High density animal farming, and we're going to talk about this a bit in class, or at least we're going to go over the pros and cons. We saw them a little bit in Food Inc., CAFOs, or you can call them CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. Sometimes they call them confined animal feeding operations, just to kind of give you an idea of the fact that they're huge structures. They're where your animals are being raised in high density numbers. So in order to kind of get across the problem of not having enough land for maybe so many animals, if you confine them to a smaller area in this cow factory kind of manner, you do efficiently raise and kill many cows for our consumption, and most of our cow comes from CAFOs. We'll talk about pros and cons in class. Harvesting and fish and shellfish. So fishing is seafood is another key protein source, and you can be fishing them. A fishery is a commercially harvestable population of fish within a particular ecological region. Fishery collapse is exactly what it sounds like, when your fish decline by 90% or more. And bycatch is unintentional catch of non-target species. So we end up accidentally bycatching animals that we didn't mean to when we were trying to fish for just fish and shellfish. Oh, and this is just kind of showing you that we have effectively been overfishing our oceans. And we will go, I will go over aquaculture more in class, because I don't think they do it justice here either. But in the meantime, I'll tell you that aquaculture is kind of your farming, of fish, farming aquatic organisms such as fish, shellfish, and seaweeds. It's done in oceans or by the sea, or by the lake. And you have these sorts of pens where you grow your fish. And I believe it's about half the seafood we eat comes from fisheries like this, fish pens or farmed fish. And this is specifically to combat the reality of overfishing. So summary, as a result of the Green Revolution and the introduction of genetically modified organisms, crop yields have increased dramatically. In the US, the biggest crop produced is corn. And as a result, corn is used as an ingredient in all sorts of foods, processed foods, including animal feed. As you saw, we feed it to our cows, our chickens, our fish. Well, chickens are okay, they like corn. Just a weird fact, about 10% of the carbon in the body of a typical American is from corn, because that's how prevalent corn is in our culture. I think that's it, actually. All right, ladies, I tried to make this a little bit faster, and I'll see you in class.